Hello and welcome to Stateline. I'm Chris Kimball. Coming up, Floriade, art, bunyips and ballet. All reasons why Canberra is a great place to live. Or is it? We've often heard this city is without soul, that the best thing to come out of Canberra is the road to Sydney or the one to the coast. It's a public service town overindulged with too many of the lucky country's luxuries. And yet there's a high level of isolation and loneliness, especially in the newer suburbs. Well, we've heard it all before. There's stereotypes about this city with origins in the 1970s. Gerald Stone reports.
All my bags are packed, I'm ready to go. I'm standing here outside your door.
Once every hour, somebody new moves to Canberra. They join a population that's the best paid, best educated, best housed in Australia. If it's really a lucky country, this surely is the luckiest city. But, ask the critics, does it have a soul?
Already I'm so lonesome, I could cry.
I'll go to Sydney, I'd go to Melbourne, I'll go anywhere. Almost, to get away from Canberra.
In Canberra you just exist all week and then you go out to Sydney where all the life is, because there's just more feeling in Sydney.
It's a success for the planners, but maybe not for the people. Only the other weekend I was down in Sydney and some people saw my ACT plate and they said, "Oh, you're the chosen people." Well, little did they know I was fleeing the promised land.
I feel as though I don't belong, and I feel as though I'm intruding if I do try to partake in something. And I'd just rather give up and not try.
Amid the wide roads, the big parks, the expensive monuments, a few voices of disillusion, and a few warning signs to back them up. According to one expert, Canberra may have a higher incidence of mild to moderate mental disorder than any other capital city. All the more dismaying in a city where everything's been laid on for the comfort of the citizen, right down to a 10-cent gas jet so that you don't have to get your hands dirty barbecuing.
I think the biggest problem is the rapid change of the human environment, the high growth rate and the high mobility rate of the city. People are changing here at 4 or 5 times the rate that they're used to in other cities in Australia. I think this is a fairly heavy burden for a number of people, though many others, of course, find it most stimulating.
One of the complaints we heard very frequently is that everything is just too well laid on, too much is given, and there's not enough of the human element in the planning here.
This may have been so with town planning in the far past, but certainly the town planners nowadays, particularly in Canberra, are coming together very much with both the community and with experts in social and emotional matters to talk about their planning at an early stage. This has happened recently with the early planning of Tuggeranong.
But do you think there is some truth in the proposition that if something is too neat, too clean, too nice, that it doesn't become or doesn't seem to be human to people?
I don't know about the neatness and cleanliness so much as perhaps I think the people who live in a place ought to, as far as possible, take as much part in the planning of that place. And this is now being thought more of here.
Every city has its knockers, but Canberra seems to have more than most. Hard to make friends, they say. Hard to keep them once you've made them. 55% of the workforce is government employed, which means a constant turnover of residents. 1 in 6 have been here less than 2 years. The public servants are blamed for bringing to the city a virulent form of social snobbery, where a grade 5 may snub a grade 4 he meets at a party.
In my opinion, there's too many public servants always talking about their job in Canberra, and they're always crawling for a higher job. In fact, it has a caste system based on public service status, and this detracts from it. It creates an artificial society, in my opinion. Certain people stick in a group together. Not that I'm complaining all that much, but the point is that it does happen, you see, and some people that are new here are left out of groups and they don't know anyone. And of course, some of the problem.
Canberra has the highest proportion of young in the country. With the 10% surplus of bachelor males, dates and sex are repeatedly easy to come by. But, they complain, outside of the hotels and a few dance spots, entertainment is dreary and monotonous. The thing most look forward to at the weekend is a trip to somewhere else. Many of the unattached young people live in big mixed hostels like Gowrie. known somewhat whimsically to the locals as Sodom and Gomorrah. But sharing meals with 550 others in a place where tables are assigned and the food doled out on a rigid 50-minute schedule doesn't always contribute to an erotic atmosphere. Gowrie, some say, can be the loneliest place in the world.
Well, if it was, a city with soul and a cosmopolitan city, would people really leave the place?
What do you think is wrong with it, basically?
Well, it's planned as a physical city, but it's not really a human city. If it was a human city, people wouldn't leave the place.
When they're extra young, and they're away from home for the first time, things could be pretty lonely if they're not willing to come out of themselves and go looking for fun rather than sit back and wait for fun to fall into their lap, because of course it doesn't. It's pretty easy here in Gowrie, to just sort of shut the door and sit in your room and feel sorry for yourself and say, oh, I've got no friends and all this sort of thing. It's very easy to do that. But
do you know girls? Sorry, do you know girls who do that?
Well, I have known of girls that do. But the thing that you've got to do is to sort of come out of yourself and get out of your room and sort of knock on the door. And if you feel lonely, if you know somebody, knock on the door and your next door neighbour or something and say, I feel lonely, talk to me, or something like that, because it's the worst thing you can do. Because the more you feel sorry for yourself, the more exaggerated things become.
Do you know this fellow over here?
We've just met. I introduced myself.
Where are you from?
Sydney.
Well, how do you think Canberra compares to Sydney?
It doesn't. It doesn't at all. No. That's weird because you've got so many different people mixed in together, people who don't know each other. Quite often you go to parties that you go to, and no one knows anyone. It's rather funny. That
you must be the first young man in the world to complain about a city where there appears to be a lot of unattached females.
I don't complain about unattached females. They're quite good. It's just the unattached males that outnumber the unattached females.
The complaints about the quality of life in Canberra have now at least received official acknowledgement. A Senate Select Committee is looking into what can be done to liven up Sundays and reduce the weekend exodus. Meantime, the question of whether Canberra is a soulless city, whether its rate of suicides and mental illness is too high, are explored in public forums like the local ABC production, Now Talk.
Through the tulips. Tonight on Now Talk, we're going to be talking about some myths, and of course there are a number of myths about Canberra. One is that we have the highest suicide rate in Australia. Another is that we have the best educational facilities in Australia. But what isn't a myth is that there are special problems about living in our city. Sylvia Gleeson is the mother of 2 children, and she lives in Chifley. Sylvia, what do you see as the cause of distress of people in your situation?
I think with young married mothers, with a young family, the main problem...
Mrs. Sylvia Gleeson has lived in Canberra 10 years. Now, as a housewife, she's moved out to one of the vast new outer suburbs in the Woden Valley, and her problems seem as bad as anything in Green Valley or Mount Druitt. Worse in some respects, she says, because there's so many roads in this allegedly planned complex that it's hard to walk across them.
Well, Canberra was originally organised as a utopia, and I think it's not a utopia. I think that we've got a lot more to hope for from planners than what we've actually got. I think in Canberra, women and children come last.
To live in a place like this, what does it do to your own well-being or the well-being of your neighbours? I'm talking about your own mental facility.
Well, I think at first there's tremendous isolation. I think that a lot of people have very unhappy times in Canberra. I had it myself when I first moved to Canberra. That was 10 years ago, when I was living at home with my parents. But since I've had children, I went through a crisis period where I was weeping a lot for some months, and I felt I couldn't cope. I think I've got neighbours who get terribly depressed and want to leave Canberra.
In a way, it would seem such an ideal place because there are people here of your own age, being a young suburb.
Yeah, well, this perhaps would be one advantage of new suburbs, but this would be an advantage anywhere. I think the disadvantage is that we don't have our grandmothers, that you have to cope on your own without help. It would be good if you could have grandmothers to take over in times of crisis and help out.
Boredom, loneliness, lack of identification. It's hard to be a newcomer anywhere. To be new in a new city must prove even more disturbing. Perhaps, as the planners insist, Canberra is bound to find itself as it grows. But now, though it's gaining 8,000 residents a year, the fastest growing city in Australia, there are few yet willing to call it home. Maybe that's what they mean when they talk about soullessness.
Already I'm so lonesome I could cry.
Well, 40 years on, has Canberra found a soul, or are we still suffering from those old stereotypes? If you recognised anyone in that story, we'd love to hear from you. The women in the Stateline office took a shine to the dashing male student, and I wonder if Sylvia Gleeson has made her peace with Chifley. Maybe we'll find out next week.